Hello, everybody. Hope everybody's here and able to see me. Let me know if you can't hear me in the comments, and as soon as I get confirmation from people, then we're going to get started. Let's see where we're at with this. It's a little bit of a lag, so it'll be a second till I know if everybody is hearing me and seeing me, as I would hope that we will. Okay, we got a yes, so we're gonna get started. All right, let's talk about using materials to tell a story. This is going to be mostly a painting demo, but I'm hoping that this is going to be applicable to a lot of different ways of approaching material. Some of you might be 3D people, some of you might be even just drawing stuff, and you can use a lot of these same principles for those sorts of things. So there's a couple of things that I really like to think about when I'm getting to the stage where I'm thinking about materials. And usually this is not the first thing. This is where you're way down the line and you're kind of finalizing a character or trying to sell it to an art director or to a team. So anyway, one of the first things that I like to look at is just the story that comes with the material by default. You know, when I look at some of these materials, I don't necessarily have any story components that come to mind, but when I look at certain qualities, you know, it's like this big fluffy fur ball over here or this one that's all sleek, they both kind of invoke this sort of story component. When I look at this rusty metal, it invokes a story feeling. When you look at gold, there's certain story associations. We have certain story associations with brushed metal, kind of the machined sort of look that it has. And so when we're talking about material and kind of the story, that's the first place that I go with it. And of course, a big part of the material is also going to be local color, and we'll talk a little bit more about that in just a minute. But the local color and using local color with color schemes is also going to be the first place that I start in telling my stories with materials. So one of the things that I learned, actually I think this is from the Netflix design series, or no, it was Abstract. Ilse Crawford talked about how one of the most interesting things about materials is when you contrast them with each other, and kind of a light went on in my brain when she said that, and I've been thinking a lot about that since, and kind of working out a lot of my theories about how to use material around the idea of contrast between materials. One of the things that she said is that when you put one material next to another material, it actually amplifies the attributes of both of those materials. And so if we take a white matte surface and we put it next to a white glossy surface, you'll notice that the contrast between those two, it's very, very subtle, but we actually really get, even in a more amplified form, the glossiness of the glossy material. And the matte quality, which you may not have even noticed in the first place, it starts to increase in its matteness. And this has all sorts of potential for storytelling as you're working. For example, what happens when you take fur and you put it with rusty metal? Now, there might be a number of story associations, but if we were to put these together on a character, where my brain goes almost immediately is almost like a Viking, somebody that's going to be out on the water and engaged in combat and everything, but maybe in the cold. We get this sort of like, you know, rough and tumble warrior-like quality out of that. Now look what changes about the story when we move using the same thing. I mean, we could be probably a couple different qualities of fur here, but when you mix fur with either gold or chrome. So if you imagine this once again on a character or like on a chair or something like that, when you put fur with one of these really glossy, shiny sorts of metal, then you get something that feels royal. It feels super plush and nice. It feels like a very fancy sort of thing. The story comes through just from the contrast of those two materials. It's pretty cool how this works, isn't it? Or what happens when we take sort of a crystal material, mix it with a cloth, and then maybe we introduce something that either has a cotton sort of vibe or even an atmospheric sort of quality to it. When you put those materials together, does your brain kind of go towards something magical? maybe it didn't immediately, but if you imagine those all three being used on a character, or maybe on the staff of a character or something like that, it definitely brings this sort of magical vibe with it. I don't know, these particular colors, I also think teenagers' room, but I guess teenager rooms like to be magic too, I guess. What happens when we take a gunmetal and put it with a wood? So does it feel like something that you'd see in maybe like a fancy high-rise New York apartment? Or does it feel like something that has a sense of sturdiness and an industrial quality, but also has this sort of nice, it's got a utility that mixes with sort of this nice fanciness, right? Kind of going back to the idea of the royal stuff we were looking at earlier. And you'll notice that these sort of material combinations you'll see a lot in really fancy furniture. So all of these materials, they become this kind of playground of taking the materials, combining them against each other, kind of seeing how those contrasts suggest things, but then think about how the context changes what the material is as well. If you change where that material is being used, we're going to see it differently. Now, I want to talk a little bit about stylization of materials, but right now we're not going to actually show how to stylize materials. I'm going to save that for the demo. Oh, one last thing that I should mention. We're going to do a demo in a minute, and just so that you have time to kind of dive in and work with me, if you go to the description of this video on YouTube, then you'll actually be able to access from there in the description there's a link to the file that I'm going to be working on. So feel free to start downloading that now so that when we get to the demo you can just start painting with what I'm doing. Of course, you don't have to paint on that. You can choose whatever it is that you want as well. So let's talk about stylization and what that means. So the biggest purpose of style, at least from the stuff that I've observed, I think there may be multiple purposes behind style, but primarily to me the purpose of style is to set the tone of the thing you're doing and to influence what your audience will expect from the experience. So style is really about these kind of central components of story. How does the audience feel about what's going on? What are they going to expect based on the style? And as you look at these different images, they're all of trees, and yet you get a very different sense of what kind of experience, what type of characters would live in this world. If somebody were to fall out of this tree, would you expect them to break their arm, or would they pop back up and be all happy? Think a little bit about that idea of how audience expectation has changed with style, because this is going to be really important as you start to stylize. Is that style, one of the most awesome things about it is that it also has a way of speeding you up. Not always, some styles actually take more time to achieve, but in the way that I'm going to be using style today, it's going to be all about speeding things up so that you can paint quickly. But you cannot let that efficiency be at the expense of the story. So make sure that you are finding ways to tell your story as you are efficient, and you'll be better off. When you are stylizing, and sometimes you'll be deliberately stylizing in order to manipulate the story, when you do that, set some rules, then be very consistent with the application of those rules. So for example, here we have a specular highlight that is following some of the same design language and shapes that we're seeing in the texture. Or here you actually see the texture of the surface dies out to sort of this flat surface, and then we see the texture show up again in the specular highlight. And that has this sort of like cell shaded quality to it that's really interesting. But once I set that rule and I paint one material that way, I can't go onto another material and go fully rendered with it. I'm going to have to keep that cell shaded vibe as I move forward. So you got to be consistent. One of the biggest problems that I see when I look at people's work that is not working, the paintings that I see all the time, whether it's in portfolios or other places, that where stuff just kind of falls apart, and it's mostly because of this consistency problem. All right, so now we're going to get to the assignment. Actually, I'll go to the chat real quick and see if there's any comments, questions to ask. We'll get to more questions at the end, but I want to make sure we're not getting too far into the painting. So let's see, it looks like, so it's not in the schedule description. You need to go to YouTube and actually follow the link to the YouTube file. So on the YouTube page, it'll be there. So go to the description of the YouTube, and that will give you what you're looking for. Looks like there aren't really any other questions right now. So let's we'll dive in and start showing some of this stuff. So here's the file that I gave you. It's supposed to be a lizard minion. I was imagining this is for a video game, and this is supposed to be a base enemy. So imagine like just kind of the cannon fodder sort of enemy for a video game. It would live, or you would find it mostly in these sort of sewer levels. And I'm imagining, rather than thinking about individual personality, we're thinking about each one kind of reflecting this sort of group personality, much like they do in video games when you're getting repeating characters. So this group personality is going to be this wild sort of slipperiness, a character that's going to be elusive and kind of slip easily from one thing to another. All the movements are going to have this slippery sort of quality, but there's also going to be this kind of wild, out of control quality that we want to get as well. And I want them to feel like part of this evil overlord's army. So it's like they've all been outfitted as aggressive minions. They're not necessarily wearing the clothes that they would wear. They're wearing what the evil overlord dressed them in, so that they feel like they're this kind of unified minion. Okay, so then there's one more special attribute, which anytime you're designing for video games, there's usually this sort of thing. Sometimes there's multiple things, and we have to think about what does this character do and how does it relate to what the player is doing. So if these are enemy minions, we want to think about how we fight them strategically and how that affects the design, and in this case the material design. So this special attribute in this case is that these characters are going to be strong when they're in the shadows. They're going to be hard to beat there, but if you can pull them into a place where there's a spotlight or something, then they'll be pretty easy to take down, the general sort of thing. So you're going to be, as you're playing the game, essentially drawing them into the light so that you can beat them more easily rather than just kind of chasing aggressively after them in the shadows. So with that said, we're going to go over here and we're going to start working on this guy. And first thing that I do is I'm looking into materials is I'm going to look at reference. And a lot of the time when you throw down your first colors or you get your first ideas, you want to go to the generic thing. You don't necessarily need to, but this is where a lot of people start. And it's not necessarily a bad thing to go to generic materials. I mean, right now we've got kind of this green lizard thing, and so looking up lizards that have that green quality, there's cool stuff that you can discover in looking at that. You know, looking at this spiked club, you might imagine many spiked clubs that you've seen before in the past, and then you might, you know, look at this armor as kind of being this Iron Man armor sort of thing. It's fine to look that stuff up and bring that reference out in front of your eyes. Sometimes it's almost better to get that stuff in front of you so that you can then decide whether to discard it or whether there's stuff that you want to pull in from what you're seeing. But then in addition to that, I would also do some reference searching that brings in some of the qualities of what we're looking at. So specifically, we're looking back to that design brief that I gave you, and this lizard doesn't have any of that wild kind of slipperiness, and yet this salamander, it does. There's something about the slipperiness of this salamander and sort of this mottled coloring that I think is pretty cool. And then we've got with the club, I like the idea of this. This is a Jeep that ran over a mattress and kind of pulled all the springs and twisted them up. There's something about the wildness and kind of hectic crazy of that I like. Oh, one thing I meant to also mention in the design brief is I'm thinking that this character would actually be able to charge up its attacks electrically, like an electric eel or something. So anyway, we might actually be able to use that to feel like it has some utility instead of just getting the look out of it. Then in addition to this, there's some elements here that instead of being interpreted as metal could actually be interpreted as cloth. And so I was imagining, what if we bring in some astronaut sort of feelings, like the evil overlord is, you know, imagining these characters being able to move between different climates or something like that. And there, I liked in particular this very dirty astronaut suit, something from, you know, way back in the day that kind of has had some moon rock and other things in it. Obviously this character wouldn't be getting in moon rock, but I think we might be able to pull some of that reference in there. And then I really liked this worm and how slimy it felt. That's something that we didn't get in any of the other reference, and that's really important. If there is something that's suggested by your design brief, that you're not getting out of any of the other materials, bring in something that's not at all like it. It doesn't necessarily have to be a lizard or a club or whatever else. I mean, kind of like I did with the Jeep thing here. I just brought in something that has the right idea. Oh, and I liked this idea as well, because if we do any Iron Man sort of elements in this armor, I like the idea of it being corroded, but not so corroded. It's like this character has been doing his thing for a little while, but this isn't like, sitting in the sewers for 40 years. So we'd have little glints of metal and then the corrosion kind of taking over that. And I think I like the sort of how the slippery and the wild, that contrast is kind of brought together in the materials that we just talked about. Now, going back to the very first slides that we were talking about with contrast between materials, I really like how these different things mix together. We're going to want to be careful not to just apply all of these ideas everywhere. We're going to be very selective about the way we apply them as we go into this. All right, so since this is a character that's going to be working in the light and dark, first place I'm going to start is with the background, mostly just because we want to show off certain attributes of the material, but we also want this rendering to feel like it's capturing some of the essence of how we would see it in the gameplay. So I might go a little lighter, a little more like a sewer light. I'm thinking like sickly fluorescent sort of colors here. And I'll try and make this feel like it's a pool of light that the character's standing in. And we're not going to spend a lot of time with the background. I just want the background to suggest enough of the setting that we're going to see this character in, that we might be able to even make the materials react a little bit to what we would be seeing in this setting. And I think I might just bring a touch of warmth back there as well, and to go a little bit darker just to kind of suggest the sewers going off into the darkness. Notice how I'm always changing temperature as I change value. That's a good habit to work on when you're painting. Just be always shifting temperature. Don't just change your value on that color. All right, let's start off with the suit, because I think this is going to be the trickiest one in terms of just painting capability. So find the suit here. And we'll just work with the metal right now. And I'm kind of feeling like in this case, we should probably just do metal first and then do the other stuff on top. That said, I think we may actually duplicate this and do two different renderings depending on what we want. So what I'll start with here is we'll get the metal thing. And first rule when you are doing specular highlights or metallic surfaces is to try and get something to reflect that's a different color in every direction, because otherwise you lose the forms. So it can be a different color, different temperature, and then keep your specular highlights from landing on the edges unless you've got something like a light source just behind the character. So in this case, we might be able to get away with something on the edge because we've got some bright in the background, but our key light, for example, that light coming in overhead, I think we're going to go towards the center of this object a little bit more, still keeping it on the upward facing planes, but we'll bring it in strongly, but we're not going to go all the way to white yet. We're going to try to get a temperature shift in there before we go to white. All right, then the other thing you need for metal to work is you need darks, because we're in a dark setting in particular. The darkness of this scene is going to be really important to how this thing works. So let's we'll just go really dark, and maybe I'll even bring this background warm temperature, and we're going to make so that all the planes that are facing away from the light start to get a little bit of that darkness to them. And I want to work quickly with this, so rather than thinking about too specifically all the metallic interactions, we're going to keep it really simple, and we're just going to try and capture the kind of main idea of that metal as it kind of reflects through here. And then I think we can start picking up some of the ground colors. So I said make sure that you're picking up a different temperature in every direction. That's exactly what I meant, is just maybe we pick up some warms from underneath here. And then we're also going to make sure that we're picking up maybe some of these cools on the upper side. Like I'm imagining, this could be a sewer grate up here. And so maybe we're getting a little bit of sky overhead. We'll keep it from getting super blue because we want this metal to get a little bit of a grimy quality, and we don't want those blues popping out everywhere too much. And then I said every direction, so maybe these sides should be picking up a different color. Maybe we'll go back to these reds, but we'll treat it as though like there's a reddish light somewhere off in the distance that we're maybe picking up on that edge. And then I think this sewer background we could probably pick up right on the very edge up here. We're going to just change that temperature a little bit, rolling between. All right, now that we've got kind of the directions established, I think we can go really strong with the specular highlight, and I'll concentrate a really strong specular highlight that goes all the way to white. Just on the planes that are, I imagine, would be facing towards the light, and I'm going to be consistent about that plane direction across this. So rather than going white everywhere, we'll just concentrate it a couple places. We might even be able to get little highlights on some of these metallic surfaces. All right, so I said this is going to be involved. Now we're going to paint this again, but now with a different surface color. And we'll probably just bring these local colors in. I'm going to roll a little warmer to match what we've got on the other surfaces. Let's actually go towards an orange for some of these downward facing planes. I put the shadows that we've got in already just as kind of a guide for where the light would go, because this isn't a how to paint the surface demo. It's more of a, how do you quickly make material decisions demo. And that means maybe just refining and streamlining things a little bit. And the other thing that we need on this surface is we need local color shifts. And this metal color that we've got going on is not going to work for that. So I'm going to do a multiply layer, and we're going to bring some kind of oranges in for the rust. And we need a different brush for this. So I'm going to look for a brush that has some spatter or texture to it. Hopefully you've got some brushes that you can bring in for that very purpose. And we're going to just dirty up this whole surface a little bit with that idea. I'd say get a little bit of variation in that color also. So maybe we get more reds in some places. And you'll notice that I'm painting this more like a matte surface. That's exactly what you should be trying to do here. Treat it like it's a matte surface. All right, so now we can take these two ideas and we can bring them together. So the metallic and the rusty are going to work, I think, just kind of exchanging back and forth. And so that I'm working non-destructively, what I'm going to do here is I'm going to create a vector mask. That's this little, it looks like a Japanese flag down here. And what I can do now is take a brush that's got a little bit of a textured quality. By the way, the brushes that I'm using come from Kyle Webster's set. If you're using Adobe CC Creative Cloud, then you should be able to get these brushes pretty easily. Otherwise, I think you have to buy them from his website. So we're going to just bring back a little bit of that metallic sort of highlight along some of these edges. Almost like the corrosion hasn't reached everywhere yet. And I think I might use a softer brush as well in doing this, just so that we're not 100%, light and dark, or metal and non-metal with this, but we're getting this kind of range of possibilities in between. And this is why we use a vector mask, because we can paint the rust back in if we go too far anyway, or anywhere. So that nice rust layer that we painted in starts immediately showing up. Now there's some more stuff we're going to paint on this metal later, like slime and buildup and everything, but that's kind of what I'm thinking. Oh yeah, there's a question in the chat that just came up that I think is really important, and I want to talk about it, which is color. And let's go onto a different canvas. So when you're talking about tips on picking local color as a base. I always like to work in color schemes. So for example, if you want to make something feel really unified, you're going to be using an analogous color scheme, just rolling a little bit from side to side in your hue wheel. Remember that as part of any color scheme, grays are also a part. So we actually have a full range of value and a full range of saturation with any color scheme. So that means that even if I go monochromatic with the color scheme, I still have gray and all the possibilities that kind of sit in between that to use in that monochromatic color scheme. So the color schemes, for those of you that need the review, most of you don't, but just in case, we might have people of all skill levels here. So we have complementary color schemes. And by the way, you don't have to be exact with these. So like a red to a bluish color also works as a complementary color scheme. A red to a green or a bluish green can also be a color complementary scheme. You might even be able to get away with a red to yellow, but usually the thing that makes it feel complementary, even when you're bringing the colors a little closer on the color wheel, is when you're not using any other colors. You're limiting it to those. And then, of course, we have split complementary color schemes. So purple and two different colors of green or yellowish green. And that's a split complementary. So we're kind of skipping the opposite side and moving to either side. And by the way, you can switch back and forth between, it doesn't have to be the RGB color wheel. Roy G. Biv works just as well. In fact, some color schemes it works better on. And I don't know if this color wheel has that ability. I don't think it does. Oh, it does. So you can actually switch to an RGB spectrum. Well, I'm not going to mess around with that right now because we're not teaching about color schemes that much. But the main rule of color schemes, once you've kind of decided which color scheme you're using, is to vary up the saturation. So you don't want all colors to be equal saturation. So maybe one is at 50%, one is almost towards gray, and then the other is, hitting towards red. And you might change that across the design. Maybe there's another part of the design where you go darker and full saturation for something else, and now you see the purple and it shows up as a gray wherever you've got that. The other thing is to avoid doing the same value. So those are kind of the main ideas when you're doing your local colors, is think in terms of color schemes. There's also some important things with composition and value scheme. I'm not going to talk about that. If you want to learn about that, I'm doing a demo later today, or I'm doing a presentation later today that'll talk specifically about that. So that's my best answer to that question, and it's a good one. I mean, the question's a good one. I don't know if the answer was good. So I'm going to make sure that we're getting a little bit of this edge in here, where we're getting kind of almost like it scraped along stuff as he was squeezing around through the sewers. And I think that's looking pretty good. All right, let's go to the skin, because the skin's kind of a problem right now. It's going into that generic land. And we're going to go find that skin. I forgot where I put the head. There's one thing about, I usually don't like to work with so many layers. I know a lot of people prefer to, but personally for me, I find that it's easier to just work on a flat canvas and only use layers where you absolutely have to. Now, going to the story of this character, I think we really want this character to stand out when it's light and hide in the shadows. So I'm actually going to bring our local values down overall. We may bring a couple things so they pop out. Maybe the eyes will glow. Maybe we'll have something else that stands out. But for the most part, we're going to make it so this character feels really dark here. And I'm going to pull a little bit from that salamander that I had reference up for earlier, which had those kind of yellow greens. And I thought that was a nice way of keeping it sort of lizardy, but bringing in some of that slippery salamander thing in local color. I think that is really cool. And maybe I'll even go a tiny bit orangish with this. We've already got the oranges in our color scheme right now, so it won't hurt to bring those back in. In the end, I think I probably going to go towards an analogous color scheme on this character. So this will be as green as I go. I'm going to stick kind of in the reds through the main parts of this character. Now we're going to have some specular highlights, which means our local color can go pretty dark. I would not go super dark with your local color. unless you have some other thing that is going to give you description. And I think this will work here. I think I also like the idea of bringing maybe a little bit of the warm colors, maybe even some of these oranges around the lips, so that we're emphasizing that mouth just slightly in this. And now we're going to bring some specular highlights in there. Now, a quick rule I learned from actually Ryan Wood, who is an incredible painter. You should check out his work. So Ryan Wood said that if you add a little bit of color shift in a specular highlight, then it feels like it's iridescent. It has a slimy quality to it. So I'm going to do that. We'll start with the specular highlight at full power first and at the regular temperature. So we'll go with kind of a big warm one. And I'm going to keep this light overhead where we've got, which means we're aiming it towards the surfaces that face upwards, but once again we're avoiding the top. We're kind of moving it towards the center a little bit. And you'll notice I'm doing a bunch of stylization decisions here, like I'm going to break it up to suggest scales as I do this specular highlight. And I may bring in the specular highlight anytime that I need to introduce a new form, like the brow may have its own specular highlight. And I think I'll do just a little bit on this cheekbone just to draw it out of there as well. Keep that kind of slimy thing going on. You'll notice that I'm using these specular highlights to roll along the surface. I'm thinking primarily about describing the form here because it's so dark and we're not going to have other descriptors here. And I think that's a really good way of thinking about it, is just description first. That said, I think there might be times when you decide to emphasize the glossiness instead and you don't do as much with the highlight. So I'm breaking this up to kind of suggest some scales here. I think I'm going to go back in on top of what I painted and kind of catch highlights on very specific scales. By the way, I always do my brush scale. I assign it to one of my buttons here so that I can just easily access that scale anytime that I want. It's the feature I use the most. I suppose if you're not scaling brushes a lot, then you can assign whatever thing that you think you're going to be using the most, but for me it's brush scale. Some people will assign it as like the color picker and stuff like that. I'm just going to catch a little highlight. So a quick rule of thumb with specular highlights is they'll catch in both the peaks and in the valleys that face towards the light source. And I think I'm going to try and keep that sort of salamandery, scaly feeling going on all the way back here. And any upward facing plane, I'm going to try and pick up that light again. And I might even cheat a little bit to describe that. Just make sure that you go a little darker when the planes start facing away from the light a little bit more. So maybe these get darker in the places where I cheated a little bit. Essentially, if you were lighting this for a film or something, you would bring in a light specifically with the purpose of describing the form, and so I have no problem cheating and moving lights in as needed in order to describe forms. You can see I'm kind of trying to bring that scaliness in everywhere. All right, and I think we probably want to keep this sort of sliminess going on in the hair, so let's move up to the hair and we'll figure out how to do that. I'm going to create a new layer and lock it to the clipping mask. And in this case, we're going to go maybe with that same red, but we're going to move it towards gray. I might keep some of that red, almost like, you know, this character dyed his hair or something like that. I'll keep it right at the tips of the hairs here. And you might be surprised at how bluish this ends up looking. Anytime you put a gray next to red, it's going to take on a bluish cast unless there's a blue nearby, which the blue is going to kind of override that color shift that you get in the red. And we'll get maybe just a little touch of the reds getting lighter down here. Again, to get that kind of dyed hair thing. I don't know why these guys would dye their hair, but I think there's something about the wild unpredictability that I think I want to keep, and putting that color in the hair I think gives us that. So with hair, we get every single strand of hair picks up a little highlight on its own, so you get an anisotropic reflection. And an anisotropic reflection is easiest to create when you have a directional brush. So in this case, we're going to lock this to that. And we're going to throw in some directional strokes here, kind of where that specular highlight is going to happen. If it's curly hair, then you're going to have multiple highlights that potentially show up against it. There's a lot of activity in the chat right now, and I'm ignoring all of you. It's not because I'm being deliberate in ignoring you. Well, I guess I kind of am. I have to focus on what I'm doing with the painting, and we'll get back to Q&A in a minute. I'll scroll up and see if we missed anything. Now, because this hair has that oily quality, I'm going to try and break up that highlight a little bit. We don't want it to be too clean, or it's going to look like he's been brushing his hair all carefully. And I think in this case, I don't really love this second highlight. I think instead what we'll do is we'll bring in a highlight for this background color, kind of reflecting off of there. And generally speaking, a light that's coming from a bouncing source is going to be much darker than the key light. So we're going to just back that off a little bit. I'm going to use the fade function, which you can find up here, fade eraser, or whatever the tool is. And you can decide what amount of brightness you want on that brush stroke that you painted in. I want just a little bit more solid there. And I think that's getting that kind of slimy thing going on. Now, I mentioned earlier that we could actually change the color of the light to get that sliminess, that tip from Ryan Wood. And if you want, you can just start adding in a touch of other colors in here. Maybe it rolls towards a greenish thing. I know we're breaking our color scheme slightly to do this, but it's a soft shift. As long as we're not going too saturated, you might be surprised at how much you can do in terms of color shifts. I think that might be a little too strong, the shifts that I'm getting in there. We'll try and keep it in the gray to red range. And we'll do the same thing on the skin specular highlight. So right here. I'm going to use some greens in that specular highlight just to get that iridescent effect, and maybe just a touch of purple around the edges just to get us that kind of slimy thing. Now, one thing that can also help get that slimy feeling, like if you're doing scales like this, you can also connect the specular highlights together, and it'll feel like there's kind of this wet quality. So if we connect that as it kind of goes in between the scales as well, it'll feel like it's not just the scales that are shiny, but that there's stuff kind of going in between the scales that's shiny as well, and we get that sort of glossy, gross, slippery sort of feeling. All right, I think that's looking pretty good. Let's just add a touch of color, and I think again we want to go towards a little gross on this character. I'm going to go with more of a blood red for the mouth color, and maybe we'll have it even go towards like a black. I'm thinking like the inside of a dog's mouth. It's like you think dogs are so cute until they open their mouth and you're like, ugh, close it up, close it up. At least that's how I am. I don't know. Most people are big fans of dogs, and I think I'm more of maybe a cat person or something. Although I don't own any cats either. Maybe I'm just not a pet person. So I'm adding in this sort of like modeling sort of color here. And then I think I want the teeth here to have a little bit more of a gross quality. They look like he's been brushing his teeth every morning, so let's get some of these yellowish greens and just make so these teeth are just as gross as everything else is. They're almost black teeth. We might bring a couple colors out from there, but you might be surprised at how much you can do with local color. It's like before you start going with all your shiny surface effects, you should always be doing going with local color first. All right, let's go with maybe a glow around those eyes. We'll make this a screen layer, and we're gonna, since the eyes are kind of a yellow right now, which I think works pretty well, we're gonna put around it a glow, and I think I want it to stand out. We'll start with an orange glow, but we may move it back towards a greenish color. The screen is an additive local color shift, or I mean an additive color shift. So those are pretty bright, and I don't know if they're standing out that great against this background. I would probably in the end darken this so that it's brighter up here, and you know we're basically getting a little bit more focus on the eyes instead of on the teeth silhouettes. Actually, let's just do it, because you guys might not believe me until I show you that it's going to be better that way. So by changing how that how the background color shifts around the face, we actually are going to increase the sort of interest that we're getting on the face itself. It's kind of seems like a contradictory thing, because composition is generally focused on decreasing contrast to lose attention on a focal point. But in this case, you actually increase the attention on the eyes as opposed to the edge of the face. And so I think it's a worthy goal to chase there. I hope you guys are having fun working on this. Hopefully you were able to download it. I know some people were having some trouble before, but you can always do it after the presentation too if you want. All right, so let's move on, and I want to talk about some of the astronaut-y sorts of components that we were doing, and I think it's going to be part of the body here. There we go, that's the one we're looking for. In this case, I'll do a selection, throw a new layer on top, and I think what we'll do is we'll make it feel like this at one time had some light to it, like it was kind of a white astronaut sort of color, and maybe we'll build that right around the heart of this thing. But then basically everywhere that this character has touched it, we're getting this kind of grossness that goes in there, and so we're gonna add all sorts of like slime and color and rust stains and things like that around the edges, and we're gonna keep it soft so it's like, you know, this gets wet a lot and it just leaches those colors through. And then I think I'll also make it so it's really gross on the creature side of things, so it's like, you know, sweating and sliming and stuff like that all the time. And so we only get little hints of the cloth as it once was. I might even make it so that this thing is, you know, rusting and dripping down in there. And you'll notice this is all happening with the local color. I don't even really have to do much else to get the colors to work the way that I want them to. You know, it's like people sometimes get too caught up in everything else, and I think like you can do so much with local color. One warning I'll give is don't get too crazy with your local color shifts. You want the form to read first over the local color shifts, and I think in this case we're getting maybe a little bit on the upper end, the upper threshold of how far you can go. I might recommend just maybe unifying these values a little bit more. If you need to, what you can do is a luminosity layer, which doesn't change any of the colors, but just shifts your values so that they match together a little bit more. So we can get all that kind of gross staining as I turn that down just a little bit. All right, and then we can collapse that together. And one thing I'd also put in here to really give it that cloth-like feeling is we need stitching. So the stitching around the edges is what's going to give it that cloth-like quality almost more than anything else. There's a couple other attributes of cloth, but the biggest one is probably if you can get this feeling like it's stitched together. So I'm going to do some like horizontal stitching, something that can help kind of emphasize the form of this thing. Keep getting glitching, which makes it hard to see what I'm doing. Hopefully that's not showing up in the stream too much. My apologies if it is. Something weird with Photoshop, and when you have a selection that's live, maybe I should turn it off so it stops happening. All right, now we're just going to do a little bit of light right on the top of that stitching. And we would probably want to do some some breakup so it looks like stitching as opposed to just like a plastic or rubber material. And I'd say that can happen just by doing regularly spaced sort of movements in the values there. So it feels like we're getting kind of like it pinched together by the cloth. And don't forget that you need to do lights and shadows for that to work. You could also actually do the stitch, the material of the stitch in the seam, so like we could actually show something in there. But to me that feels a little bit more like he's stitched it together himself, and I think I would rather just make it feel like it's pinched together by the stitches. I think that'll be a little more effective. Now for the sake of time, I'm going to move on and we'll try and establish maybe some of what we were talking about here on the club, because we are down to our last few minutes on this demo. And we'll find that club here. There it is. And biggest thing, I'm not even going to deal with the spikes because we've kind of talked about all the materials there, but I want to get that feeling of wood that's kind of got all these metal things twisted around it. And I think this local color is pretty good with wood. One thing I'm just going to throw in to get that wood feeling is we're going to get, of course, the grain of the wood. And I think we want the particular grain and type of wood here to feel like something that matches this character. So I'm thinking maybe like a driftwood sort of feeling, in which case I might leach some of the color out of these and make it so that there's bigger kind of gaps in this. And then I think it'll feel like the wires are kind of keeping this together. We could even make it so it feels like these gaps are being forced apart a tiny bit by the spikes that have been shoved in there. And I think I'll go much darker to just kind of get the crevices in there, but you don't want the crevices to be dark everywhere. We'll put them in and then kind of let it ease up a little bit as we get farther away from the deepest parts of the crevice. It's like you can overwhelm people very quickly with deep texture decisions like that, so you want to be sparing in the way that you apply them. And I think I'll do some crossing sort of lines in the wood to give it that kind of dry, cracked wood sort of feeling. We're actually going to do a sort of layered effect here. So we're going to make it look like dry, cracked wood first, and then we're going to throw all the stuff around it, and then we're going to make it look like we'll make it look like it's wet again. So it's like we take that dry, cracked wood and hydrate it. So I'm going to throw down kind of where I want the lines of these wires to go, almost be like barbed wire wrapped around a bat sort of feeling, but I'm going to make it so it feels like the wiring kind of twists around here. Now we may break the silhouette, but this is a game character, and so I don't think we want to break the silhouette as much as you might normally. We're going to try and, in this case, it's like, you want to think about what's going to be a normal map and what's going to actually be geometry. And in this case, it's like, I don't know if this stuff is important enough to have it be its own geometry. That said, we could break the silhouette just slightly in a couple places without hurting anything, most likely. One thing that I am going to want to do, but I won't have time for in this demo, is I'd probably make some connection point for him to like send the electricity down this thing. But for now, we're just going to work with this, and we're going to get some of these metal colors that we had. I'm going to start with the rust, and this time, because we have really fine detail, I think I can cheat some of the stuff I was doing and just go really, really fast to describe what is going on here. I want it to feel like this stuff is wrapped around the spikes as well. It's kind of like crazy tangle of wires. And I think I'm going to try to introduce some of that like wild shape language that we had going on in these wires. And I'll probably twist a few more just in one place to make it so it feels like it's really, really twisted. The thing is, what I put underneath were mostly shadows for these wires. So if I go outside of the boundary of what I was just doing, I may have to recast some of those shadows for this to work. We want it to feel like there's a little bit of dimension to these wires instead of it just being something that's drawn on the surface. Okay, then, since we're kind of cheating some of the stuff we had going on here, I'm going to put in some specular highlights, but this time I'm just going to break it up by hand. So we'll throw in specular highlights selectively across these wires. We'll make it feel like this has kind of a grimy specular quality to it. And or like the corroded nails that I showed in the reference. And by the way, it's fine if you have the reference up the whole time. I mostly didn't want anything getting in the way of the painting process as I did it for the demo, but I would usually have the reference up and ready to see at all times as I'm doing this sort of thing. We'll get some of that bounce light showing up underneath here as well to get that metallic sort of twist. And I think I'll just do like a couple of really strong specular highlights just as a reminder that this is in fact metal. I don't think we want it everywhere, but just enough of these places that it works. And then of course you'd also get them on the spikes probably in a couple places as well. So anyway, I think we may do more demo stuff depending on the types of questions that come up, but rather than continuing on rendering this throughout the rest of this, I will post this on my social media later if you want to see where I take it for the rest of this. But let's go see your questions right now. So let's see what you guys have to ask. Somebody says, do you have a template guide or tutorial for the material spheres you showed in the beginning? It seems like a good exercise for practicing those textures. It is a good exercise. I don't think you need a template, but I do have a schoolism class that kind of talks about how to achieve all of these material effects. That goes way beyond the scope of what we could do in the hour here, but that's a good question. Okay, so don't really see any other questions. I'm scrolling up through this. Do you always stick with the same warm, cool, light, dark relationship? Yeah, I tend to. It's like if I've got warm shadows underneath, or warm bounce underneath, then I'm going to make all of my shadows on the underside be warm. If I decide that I've got sky overhead, I'm going to make it so that everywhere it's kind of the same color up on top. The exception to that is going to be in cases where I'm trying to think of what exceptions. Oh yeah, like if something is blocking the light from above, like on this arm down here, I might do less of the blue on this arm because the head is potentially blocking some of the blue light that's coming in to fill some of those other shadows. Okay, question. Any direction on how to paint cinematic color style. So the dark is really dark, almost total black, but not making it muddy. Okay, so the key to that is going to be all about midtones. And I'll show you just on a quick layer here. If I were to just change the exposure of this or adjust the black level in this scene, you'll notice it works out pretty well. And most of what, got a flash sort of weirdness going on there, that we've actually got all of the richness in the colors that we originally had, even though we changed the black level. So that's one way. You can actually paint it more similar to what I did and then just bring that black level up. Obviously you can see the local color got way too dark for this, and you'd probably have to brighten that up to match what's going on there. But yeah, I think the other way of doing that is going to be in your midtones. So what's happening here is that these areas where it's dropping into black, you're actually getting a slightly saturated version of the color on the midtone that just keeps that gradient from feeling dead. It's kind of an old school painter's trick, but you should use it a lot because it's going to make your stuff look awesome if you do. Let's see. So people are asking if this will be saved for later viewing. Yes, it will be. Let's see, the rust part, I'll just go back to that so you can see. I actually painted the rust separately, separate layer from the specular highlights, and then just kind of erased away the rust layer to show what was going on there. Do you use a different approach for transparent materials like glass? Yep, let's do a quick demo on that. So we'll actually do it in this lighting in this scene. I'm glad you brought that up because I was originally going to put some glass elements in this, but we just ran out of time. But what we'll do is we'll paint a quick something, make it so that there's a glass thing going on up here. We'll make it like a solid glass ball here, because if you understand how solid glass works, you can paint basically anything else. And what we'll do is we'll make it in the same color scheme. Maybe it'll be like a greenish glass. We'll go with that greenish yellow. So the trick with glass is that you're going to have both internal refraction and you'll also get external reflection, and those two things are going to work together. And so the internal refraction, just rule of thumb, is if you have a curved surface, every glass is going to have a focal point. If you've ever held a magnifying glass up with a light source behind it, there's a point, a distance at which that thing comes into focus, and then as you pull it farther away, then it becomes big and soft. What's really happening is the light rays are crossing over at that focal point. So the focal point is where the light rays touch together. And so basically what happens is beyond that point, everything is reversing. And so if you can imagine the scene behind this, if you were to just take this scene and flip it upside down and paint it as such, but of course now with a green filter. So now we've got kind of the darks that are on the edges of the screen. We have the shape of the light as it goes into the background. We might even have the really concentrated little light that we've got there, but now of course coming once again through the greenish filter, which will saturate the greenish color we've got, and we get this sort of like reconcentration. Sometimes people will just cheat this and do like dark on top, light on bottom, and it works pretty well for communicating a glass thing. One other thing is that the light has a harder time passing through thick glass, and you lose light on the edges as it turns away. So that's why that's a pretty good approximation of what's going to happen with glass. If there's any objects behind this, we would also see those objects going through that glassy part as well. And so we could paint stuff, although in this case I think I'm not going to necessarily worry too much about that sort of thing. We'll just try and get the glass color in there, and then we'll do the reflection on the surface. Now the reflection on the surface on glass tends to be glossy, and what that means is small specular highlights, or sorry, sharp edge specular highlights. So in this case we get that sewer grate up there. We can cut the little holes in the sewer grate, which we didn't put in the background, but we'll paint it in the highlight. And then sometimes you'll have other things like maybe the glow of the sky on top of that. I'll make this a lightened layer so it just adds on top of what I'm doing instead of overcoming that. And then maybe there will be other things reflected in the scene, like the light in the background or off of the floor. And this will be the same color as what we've done, and I'll do this as a separate layer right now, lock it to the transparency. What you get is something called a Fresnel effect, which means that towards the center of the object you get less reflection, and towards the edges you get more. So I'm going to erase a little bit towards those edges, and then I'm going to usually turn that way down so we can make this a additive or screen layer, but I don't want it to be too super strong to where it feels like we've got a light source. We just want it to be kind of this soft little glossy thing. And you can put other reflections in there. I mean, this is reflecting stuff from all around the scene, things that you might not even see in it. So you could say, well, there's a big pole next to this guy that's kind of white, and put that in the reflection. Just make sure that only the light source is reflecting at full power. And for me, that's kind of the quickest way to get that glass look, very, in a cheap way without understanding everything we're doing. The brush I'm using is from Kyle Webster's Mega Pack. It's called the Kyle Ultimate Oil Lush. I like it for a lot of things. Okay, so somebody says this is a primitive question. If you can elaborate on why we do a sphere study. So I call it a sphere test, and if you can calculate how light is going to behave on a sphere, you can then start picking plane angles around that sphere and color picking them and applying them to the stuff that you want to do. So for example, if we were to do like a cylinder, the cylinder is going to be basically a vertical cross section of this sphere, then extruded, and that's how you're going to light it. And so the sphere test is just the quickest way to calculate the light. It removes all the variables and then allows you to essentially quickly translate to other things. Somebody says, if we have a colored light source, will it force its color over the local color? And if the color source is blue or violet, will the shadows become reddish or greenish? Okay, that's a great question. And I think the answer is way more complicated than we have time for right now. I think the most important answer to that question is you need to focus on why you're doing the light color change. Because in this case, when we're doing a character design and we're trying to show off the materials, we don't want super strong light colors. It's okay to do a little bit of temperature shift, but I wouldn't go too crazy with the light colors. I would keep it pretty simple and straightforward and be more descriptive, especially with concept art. So somebody says, every time I try to paint metal, it still looks like plastic or stone, or I'll overdo reflection and it looks really chrome. So chrome is a great place to start when you're doing metallic surfaces. You notice that that's kind of where I started. Chrome obviously has sharper edges than what I did. But if you can paint something so it looks like chrome, then it just becomes a matter of working everything else out. The key to making reflections or specular surfaces like this work is all about hierarchy of light sources. So if you have a key light that's very, very bright, and then everything else in your reflection sphere or reflection on the surface gets darker from there, and you have differences in value going across, then you're going to have much better looking metal. The other thing is that you're always losing light in reflection, and so when you're painting metal, you want to make sure that any dark stuff that's being reflected from the scene gets darker than what you're seeing in the scene, and that will help you. So anyway, I think, unless I see any desperate questions here at the end, I'm probably going to end right here. So tips for painting leather, that's a good one. So I would get reference, first of all. Make sure that you know exactly what type of leather that you're trying to paint. But beyond that, leather and skin are very similar, but leather has less subsurface scattering. So the type of texture, reflection work, everything else that you do on skin and leather are going to be almost the same. So learn how to paint skin, remove some of the specular highlights, shift the color a little bit, and usually you got a leather look. One of the things about leather is that it'll sometimes get fraying and color shifts because it's leather that's in use, and get reference for that because it's hard to just make it up. Okay, I think that's all. Thank you so much, everybody, for showing up, and we'll see you later.